Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Committee of Advertising Practice webinar on disclosure of host-read ads in podcasts. This presentation is aimed at helping you get to grips with some new guidance on this topic that's coming into force very soon. My name is Beth Irwin, and I work in the regulatory policy team at CAP. We are the team that writes and maintains the codes and guidance. Just a little bit of housekeeping first of all. This session is being recorded, and so it will be made available for you afterwards, along with slides. If you have any questions that occur throughout the presentation, please do put them in the Q&A box, and we will come to some of those at the end. Okay, so just a quick agenda. We'll do an introduction to the ASA and CAP system, the relevant rules that underpin this guidance. We'll look at the scope of the guidance and the consumer research that it's based on. We'll obviously go through the key principles and some resources that can help you in your application of the guidance as well. And then, as I said, we'll have time for a few questions as well at the end. So just a quick introduction to what the ASA system is and does for anyone who's less familiar. We are the UK's advertising regulator. We're an independent self-regulatory body that's recognised as the established means of regulating advertising content in this country. The ASA is made up of two parallel bodies. The ASA itself, which administers and enforces the rules laid out in the advertising code. So that includes investigating and producing rulings on breaches of the code. And then the Committee of Advertising Practice, which writes, helps enforce, and advises on the advertising codes to industry. And that's the side of the organisation that I'm representing today. So we'll have a look at the specific rules that are relevant to this guidance. You can see on your screen three rules taken from section 2 on recognition of advertising in the CAP code. So as you can see, these rules make clear that marketing communications must be obviously identifiable as such. They mustn't falsely claim that a marketer is acting for purposes outside of their business or trade, and that advertorial, so that is paid for content that takes a similar form to editorial content, is clearly marked out as such. These second two rules derive from prohibited practices in the consumer protection regulations, the CPRs, which govern, excuse me, which govern consumer protection regulation in the UK. And so these are practices that are considered in all circumstances unfair and so are prohibited. The perhaps the most relevant is the Rule 2.4, and the text of that from the law talks about using editorial content in the media to promote a product where a trader has paid for the promotion without making that clear in the content, or by images or sounds clearly identifiable by the consumer. So, as you can tell, that is not prescriptive of the means by which the commercial nature of content should be made clear, but it is clear that it could be by way of sounds or images, thus indicating that it applies to audiovisual formats. So some of you may be aware that there have been recent updates to UK consumer law through the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act, which has made a number of changes to wording, which the ASA is in the process of considering what implications that may have for our own rules. However, for our purposes today, the content of these particular prohibited practices have not been subject to any significant change in the new legislation. Now, podcasting, where ads are very often read by the presenters or the hosts of the programme, is a medium where there is certainly a risk of ad contents blurring the lines with editorial. particularly where we know that, research has shown that listeners tend to be highly engaged with the content and have sort of trusting relationships with favored hosts, etc. So CAP has previously had online resources specifically about the recognition of ads in podcasts. However, this has largely been adapted from advice on other types of non-broadcast media and did not necessarily take into account the particular characteristics of podcasting, which is fairly unique within non-broadcast space as being audio-only medium. In addition, the ASA has fairly little precedent of adjudications on ads in podcasts. It's a relatively small marketing sector. We have received relatively little complaint about ads in this format in the past. However, recognizing that it's a growing ad market, particularly since the pandemic. And in 2022, a ruling on an ad for Huel in the Diary of a CEO podcast further brought to light the lack of medium-specific guidance in this area and concerns from industry about ad labeling guidance designed for other media, not necessarily being appropriate for audio-only types of formats. So while that ruling didn't make any pronouncement on particular wording that would be more likely to identify a podcast ad, CAP recognised it would be beneficial to conduct consumer research to gain some insights into how podcast audiences engaged with and understood podcast ad content. So I should point out as well, as perhaps it's clear from the points we've made on these slides, but this was not kind of preceded by a context where we were seeing evidence of widespread non-compliance in this area, but rather a response to kind of a need for medium-specific guidance to provide some more clarity for industry. So we undertook research with an external research agency, Jigsaw, and you can read the full research report on our website. I would recommend doing that. It's quite an interesting read, in addition to kind of getting some more sort of a fuller picture of the background to this guidance. It's also got some other interesting insights, kind of aside from the recognition aspect. So you can have a look at that on our website. In terms of the structure, it comprised a number of group interviews, total of 47 participants with a sample designed to be representative of the demographic makeup of the UK population. In terms of the examples of the stimulus material used, we scoped that from a range of UK podcasts across a variety of genres, of styles, and of approaches to labeling as well. So these were real ads, and they were played in context to participants with some of their surrounding editorial content to give us the opportunity to assess participants' perceptions of the distinction between that content. So this new guidance reflects insights from that research. As with all our CAP guidance, it's not intended to be prescriptive, but it reflects best practice recommendations coming out of the evidence. Ultimately, the decision of whether an ad breaches the code can only be made by the ASA Council through an investigation. It may be that as this guidance is put into place, that we see some more precedent rulings that further flesh out detail of what it looks like to stay on the right side of the line as we would in any other area. So the scope, the guidance applies to ads featured in or around podcast episodes, which are read by the host or hosts of the podcast in question. So that largely pertains to ads in ad breaks. We do also talk about paid for content that is more incorporated into the episode's editorial. And that should be the guidance should be read in relation to that type of content as well. However, I'll talk a bit about that separately, as there are some different considerations. So when listening to the broad principles of the guidance, do bear in mind that they are primarily based around host-read ads in ad breaks, which were the predominant type of this form of ad that we found in our scoping work. So what the guidance does not apply to, it doesn't apply to ads that are read out by a third party who's not a presenter of the surrounding podcasts, because that eliminates that sort of risk of confusion with the editorial. And as such, those types of ads are more likely to be identifiable from their context. So in terms of timing, as you'd be aware, the research and the guidance were published on our website in May. We put in place a 3-month implementation period, so that is coming to an end on the 16th of August, quite soon, and that's when that is coming into force. So with that, we'll move on to the key principles themselves. So firstly, participants found it extremely valuable for ads to include a clear upfront labeling term, preferably at the very start of the ad, so that they knew immediately what they were listening to. The very best terms were found to be clear, explicit phrases like "this is an ad." And further to that, we found that variations on sponsored by were also quite well recognized and familiar to listeners as a way of marking out commercial content in podcasts. So again, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but it gives you an idea of the two different broad types of label that are more likely to comply according to the research, and for which in practice there are likely to be a range of different variations of precise wording. Again, the ASA, when investigating a potential breach of the rules, will always take into account the individual merits and context of an ad. So we've also provided here some examples of approaches that were tested that were less clear to participants. And those included things like "brought to you by," "with our friends at," "our partners," etc. We did also test some examples that made no attempt at labeling, which unsurprisingly were the most confusing and the least recognizable to participants. But I should say that we found relatively few examples of that type of approach in our scoping work. So in addition to clear labeling, there are a number of other factors that were found to enhance listeners' comprehension that they were hearing an ad. Firstly, music or sound effects played before and after an ad or an ad break could help mark it out as separate from the editorial content. Then we have length, so a short, sort of focused length was preferred. Participants were less keen on what they sort of characterized as long tangents diverging from the topic of the ad. This could sort of contribute to confusion about the bounds between editorial and advertising. And then the other key factor that came out was a change in tone of voice between the main programming and the ad. So on that final one in particular, we do recognize that perception of differences in tone of voice could be somewhat subjective in some cases, and podcasts obviously cover a wide range of subject matter and tone, and abrupt tonal shifts may not necessarily be appropriate or feasible. But this factor is less likely to be necessary where other factors are employed, but it is nonetheless a useful finding in many contexts. And I would say overall, the key point here, the key principle coming out of the research was the use of a clear labeling term at the beginning of the ad. These additional factors are likely to enhance in the presence of that label, but it is certainly not an expectation that advertisers would employ every single one of these. However, the use of more of these factors is probably more likely to see ads stay on the right side of the line. So I mentioned paid for content within editorial. So this is where paid for references feature within the main programming rather than in ad breaks. And of course, these instances should also be made identifiable where they occur. We understand it may not be feasible to employ that range of factors outlined more broadly, which however, these types of instances certainly should be verbally marked out from the editorial with some sort of clear statement, and would refer you back to those recommended terms that came out of the evidence. So content in other media, of course, podcasting is originally and primarily an audio-only medium, but increasingly diversified into video in particular, format for episodes. So advertisers do need to be aware and have regard to the particular characteristics of the medium in which the podcast is being made available to audiences, as different steps may be needed to make commercial content clear in different formats. We are aware that in many cases, ads are created and inserted in ways that are tailored to the specific medium and may not be reproduced in an identical form, in which case this is going to be less of a consideration. But theoretically, for example, if you have the same audio ad used in a video, that might require additional visual labeling on screen to make it sufficiently identifiable in that format, in line with the advice on the medium in question. And on a related note, where ads are reproduced in other media with additional accessibility provisions, if indeed they are, they should be made clear in a way that's appropriate to the target audience. So, for example, transcripts of episodes created for people with hearing impairments, or videos with captions. In the event that podcast ad content is actually reproduced in these formats, which of course there is no requirement that they are, but we just want to draw attention to that. Again, advertisers should be mindful of potentially taking additional steps to make ads clear. Finally, remember that the rest of the rules in the CAP code also apply across podcast ads, as they do for all non-broadcast media. So this includes rules on all sorts of subjects, misleading advertising, of course, specific rules for different types of health products, food supplements, age-restricted products where there might be targeting concerns at play, and promotional marketing. For example, if you are using promoting discount codes or competitions, prize draws, there are specific rules about these types of topics covered in the CAP code. You can find the rules and various resources providing detail about these different topics on our website. There's a list of different resources there that may be of use for keeping up to date with different developments, and perhaps the most important is the bespoke copy advice service, which provides free advice on non-broadcast advertising pre-publication. That includes podcasts, of course, so do make use of it if you don't already. If you have any questions or uncertainties about whether copy is compliant. So that's the end of the core content that we have today. We can take some questions now. So I will see if we've got any questions in the Q&A box. I can't see anything.
So someone's asked, could this recording be shared around to attendees who are not able to make the call? Yes, it can. Beth did mention at the beginning, the session's being recorded, so a version will be available on our website. And for those who've attended the session, they'll receive a link directly. Beth, are you still able to not see the questions, or do you want me to read them out?
I can't see them, I'm afraid. So yeah, if you could read them out.
No problem. One question was, why does it only apply to hosts? What if the podcast is a conversation between the host and guests, and it's the guest who delivers the ad?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the same principle would apply where it's it's related to the content of the episode. It's being read out by someone who is involved within the episode. I think that same principle could be applied in that instance.
Thank you. The less clear wording, such as partner of this episode or brought to you by, we recently got CAP advice on a piece of copy that said partner, and it was deemed clearly identifiable. So generally, even though it's less clear, is it still clear enough not to be in breach?
So those main terms, types of terms that are recommended, those were the terms that were found to be the most recognizable, the strongest coming out of the research. So we would strongly advise the use of those terms. It's not to say that a different term could never be acceptable, could never be sufficient to denote that content is paid for. Taking into account other contextual factors as well. As I said, the decision on that can only be made by the ASA Council through an investigation. Copy advice, of course, provide advice based on our precedent and existing advice, but it is advice. It is not binding on the ASA Council. Um, but yeah, ultimately, this is something that would need to be um, established through some sort of ASA case precedent, which we don't currently have in this area.
Thanks. Another question is, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, but will the ASA be using AI to check ads in podcasts in a similar way to how they're doing with the active ad monitoring system?
Yeah, it's also an interesting question. That's not something that I'm aware of as a current strand of AI monitoring, but as you may be familiar with, the ASA is increasingly expanding its sort of data science and AI monitoring use of those types of technologies in its proactive monitoring. So that is potentially something we could look at in the future.
Thanks. I can answer this one quickly, Siobhan. Regarding the slides, yes, you will receive a copy of the slides after the session. Next question, how often should the disclosure be made in a podcast in case someone is not listening to the entire thing?
So I think within an ad itself, as I said, we would expect that disclosure to be made right at the beginning. Yeah, if it's sort of repeated, if there's different ads repeated throughout a podcast, for example, then we would expect probably the disclosure to be at the outset of each one.
Okay, thank you. Someone asked, is there a reason that sponsored by is acceptable for podcast ads, but not for image ads? For example, the ones on Instagram.
Yes, so we've conducted medium specific research on this particular topic, and so um, we are sort of taking our lead and our insights from that research that focuses on a particular medium that has particular attributes. And the ASA's guidance, or the ASA's guidance on ad labeling in influencer marketing is based on separate medium specific research that was done on that particular medium. So there are, there are perhaps understandably differences coming out of those pieces of research, as they're different media, they have different attributes. And we think it's, it's legitimate to take into account medium specific considerations when looking at guidance around ad labeling in different formats.
Brilliant, thanks. A copy of the research will also be sent around in the follow-up email for those who have attended, just in case you wanted to delve into that in a bit more depth. If anyone has any more questions, please do pop them in the Q&A. We still do have time to go through some. Another question that has popped up is, in case of podcasts that are available on YouTube with video also, would it be necessary to have a disclaimer in writing too if they're advertising your product?
Yeah, so obviously if it's an ad that is being used in a video format, we would expect that to be in line with the advice that's specific to that format. So the example I gave was if you have an audio ad that is then reproduced in a YouTube version of an episode, you may well need to include visual labeling on the screen as well, as you've got that visual element in addition, and that is the kind of the advice that we use in terms of labeling on video, on YouTube video or video formats generally.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Beth. Again, if anyone has any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A. Otherwise, we'll round up the session. But yeah, we still got 3 minutes left, so we'll just wait a bit to see if anyone wants to pop something in. Nothing has been put in yet, I'm afraid. So got two minutes left. So if nobody has any further questions, that's fine. If anything pops into your head following this session, like I said, you will receive a copy of the recording and the slides. Final question of today. One has just popped in. If there's a branded episode, would we need to label it in the episode title too that it's paid for?
That's a good question. I That's not something that we necessarily specifically looked at in this research, but certainly if the content has been paid for, then that needs to be made clear up front. I couldn't comment necessarily on whether there'd be an expectation that would be in the title of the episode. But I suppose considering that the listener is going to be encountering paid content from the outset, potentially there could be a need for that to allow them to understand that that's what they're engaging with. But that might be one to kind of get advice from copy advice on.
Brilliant. We've just had 2 questions come through. Hopefully they'll be quite quick and then we'll have to wrap up, I'm afraid. But someone's asked, must video description state it includes ads? Is the first one. I guess if the podcast is on YouTube, I'm assuming.
I don't think that's necessarily relevant to this particular guidance. So we're talking about the labeling of ad content when it appears. The fact that the video contains ads generally, I don't necessarily think that that's something that we would for the purposes of this guidance expect that was indicated in that way. It's about whether the ad itself, when it's, when that content appears, whether that's made upfront and clear to consumers at the earliest opportunity.
Okay, brilliant. It might also be a question worth directing to copy advice because I know that there is some guidance regarding, as Beth said, making ads obviously identifiable and upfront. So that's something that I can send in the follow-up. And finally, saying brought to you by XYZ brand, is that allowed or does it need to be sponsored by XYZ brand?
Yeah, so as I said, the strongest terms that we found, the ones that we would strongly recommend that people use, were these variations on ad for or sponsored by. Um, Brought to you by was one of those that was found in the research to be less well recognized, so perhaps be more of a risk to use. Though, as I said, this is not prescriptive. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that it could be sufficient in combination with other contextual factors, but this is kind of the best practice recommendation that we think is more likely to keep advertisers in compliance with the codes in terms of using those terms that were found to be best recognized by consumers in the research.
Brilliant, thanks. That's the last question that we have today. I'll pass back to you, Beth.
Yes, so thank you very much for listening. We'd very much appreciate if you could just take a few moments out of your day to leave some feedback at the end of this before you go. But yes, I'll just say thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.